Imagine a place so brutal that even trees refuse to grow there. A chain of islands on the edge of Scotland, hit by force 10 Atlantic hurricanes every single winter. No wood, no shelter, no mercy. And yet, the people here built a house that heated itself, fed itself, and survived storms that would flatten a modern building. No engineers, no modern materials, just rocks, rope, and pure human genius. This is the story of the Scottish Blackhouse. And trust me, by the end of this video, you will never look at a building the same way again. On the northwestern edge of Scotland, there is a place the ocean never leaves alone. The Hebrides archipelago, a chain of bare, broken islands emerging from the vast Atlantic Ocean. Every single winter, winds from the Atlantic come screaming in, reaching force 10, powerful enough to flatten anything in their path. No trees grow here. The land has nothing to offer. No timber, no resources, no shelter. And yet, the people who lived here did not run away. They did not give up. They looked at this impossible environment and they built something extraordinary. They built the Blackhouse, a fortress of stone, engineered to withstand what nature threw at it every single day. But here is the first problem they faced, and it was a big one. To build a roof, you need wood. And on these islands, there was not a single tree. Not one. So where did the wood come from? The answer will completely change the way you think about what is possible with nothing. The Atlantic Ocean, that same ocean trying to destroy their homes every winter, was also their lumberyard. The Gulf Stream, a powerful underwater current stretching over 3,000 miles, carried pine and spruce logs all the way from the forests of North America and delivered them right onto the shores of the Hebrides. And when merchant ships wrecked in Atlantic storms, their broken timber, their heavy floorboards, their long oars, all of it washed ashore. Nothing was wasted, not a single splinter. The islanders developed a careful system. Every piece of wood that hit the beach was inspected, classified, and given a job. The longest and heaviest beams became the main rafters, the skeleton of the roof. Smaller broken pieces became joining pegs and secondary supports. But here is where it gets even more interesting. This driftwood, wood that had been floating in salt water for months, was actually better than fresh timber. Because salt water does something remarkable to wood. It penetrates deep into the grain, making the timber naturally resistant to rot, to fungus, to insects. In a climate where humidity never drops below 80%, this salt-soaked ocean wood outlasted any freshly cut timber on Earth. The ocean was not their enemy. It was their greatest supplier. Now let's talk about the walls, because this is where the real genius begins. Look at these walls closely, and you will immediately notice something. They are massive. At the base, they measured between 1.5 to 2 meters thick. That is almost 6.5 feet of pure stone. But thickness alone was not the secret. The walls tapered inward as they rose, getting narrower and narrower toward the top. Engineers today call this a batter design, and it served one critical purpose. It kept the center of gravity low, making the entire structure incredibly stable, even in the most violent Atlantic storm. But here is what most people do not know. The wall was not solid stone. It was actually two separate walls, built side by side, an outer skin and an inner skin, with a deliberate gap running between them. This gap was packed with peat, mud, moss, and even household waste. This was the insulation core, and it worked on two levels. First, waterproofing. When Atlantic storms drove rain into the outer wall, the peat and mud core absorbed it like a giant sponge, stopping every drop of water before it could reach the living space inside. And to make this even more effective, every stone in both walls was tilted slightly outward, so gravity itself constantly pulled any penetrating water away from the interior. Second, thermal mass. During the day, the thick walls slowly absorbed heat from the central fire and from the livestock living inside. At night, they released that stored heat back into the home, like a giant stone radiator, running all night without burning a single extra piece of fuel. Now here is the most surprising engineering decision of all. No mortar. Every single stone was stacked completely dry. No cement, no binding agent, nothing. To a modern builder, this sounds absolutely insane. Surely a mortared wall would be stronger? Actually, no. And here is exactly why. A mortared wall is rigid. When a hurricane-force wind hits a rigid wall, all that energy has nowhere to go, except straight into cracking the mortar. Over time, rigid walls fail. They crack. They crumble. They collapse. But a dry stone wall has something engineers call ductility, a controlled, calculated flexibility. When the wind hits, the wall does not crack. It vibrates. It shifts, ever so slightly, absorbing the energy of the storm and dispersing it harmlessly. The wall breathes with the storm, instead of fighting it. And there was one more benefit that most people never think about. A wall with no mortar allows moisture from inside the home to seep out naturally through the stones. This prevented the interior from becoming a cold, damp, dangerous space. Mortar was used in only one place, around door frames and at particularly vulnerable gaps, purely to block freezing cold drafts. Everywhere else, pure dry stone engineering, a wall that moved with the storm, a wall that breathed with the climate, a wall that was not fighting nature, but working with it. Now let's get to the roof, because the walls alone were not enough. The roof was the most vulnerable point of the entire structure, and the islanders knew it. One wrong decision here, and the Atlantic would tear the whole thing apart in seconds. So they did something remarkable. They studied the wind. They watched how storms moved, how air behaved, how pressure built up, and then they engineered a roof that used all of that against the storm itself. Their first decision was the shape. They chose a hipped roof, one that slopes down on all four sides with rounded corners. This was not about looks. This was pure physics. When hurricane-force winds hit a flat-sided roof, they create enormous drag and lift forces that can rip the entire roof clean off in a matter of seconds. But a rounded, hipped roof, the wind flows smoothly over it. The drag drops dramatically. The lift almost disappears entirely. The storm had nothing to grab onto, but the shape was just the beginning. The real secret weapon was something called the Tova technique. And this single idea is what separated the Blackhouse from every other building on Earth. Here's how it worked. On most buildings, the roof frame sits right at the outer edge of the wall. This means the wind traveling up the side of the building hits the eaves directly, the overhanging edge of the roof, with full force, creating massive upward lift. The Blackhouse builders did something different. They moved the roof frame inward. At this temper sitting on the outer edge, the entire roof structure was set back onto the inner stone shell. This left a wide, flat ledge on top of the outer wall. That ledge was the tova, and it was a pressure trap. When wind rushed up the side of the wall, it hit the tova and was forced to jump completely over the roof. The eaves, the most fragile point of any thatched building, were completely hidden from the storm. Protected, untouchable. And by rounding the corners of the walls, the builders eliminated something else entirely: the dangerous air vortexes that normally form behind sharp corners, pulling stones apart, destroying buildings from the outside in. Gone. Completely eliminated. But there was still one more problem. How do you keep the thatch from flying away? In a Force 10 hurricane? Nails? No. Rigid iron nails would snap under storm stress in minutes. So the Scots used something far smarter. They used gravity. A complex web of ropes called sugan, hand-woven from heather and straw, was laid across the entire roof surface. Horizontal ropes ran across at regular intervals, providing anchor points, or diagonal ropes that crisscrossed every inch of the thatch. And at the end of every rope hung a large, heavy stone, dangling freely around the edge of the wall. Not fixed, not nailed, not rigid, hanging freely. This created what engineers now call a dynamic tethering system. The hanging stones constantly pulled the thatch downward, but because they were free to move, the entire roof could vibrate, flex, and breathe with the wind. In the most violent Atlantic storm, the roof did not resist the wind. It moved with it, a living, breathing, flexible shield, not a brittle structure waiting to break. The wind came, and the Blackhouse simply let it pass. Now this is where the Blackhouse stops being just impressive and becomes genuinely extraordinary, because the inside of this stone structure was not just a living space, it was a precision-engineered thermal machine, a closed-loop energy system, where every single source of heat was captured, recycled, and used again, nothing wasted, not a single watt. Let's walk through it, layer by layer. Layer 1, biological heat. At the lower end of the Blackhouse lived the cattle. A herd of 5 to 10 Highland cows. Now this was not just for their convenience, this was a deliberate engineering decision. A single adult cow generates approximately 100 watts of body heat through its natural metabolic processes, just by breathing, just by existing. 10 cows? That is a full kilowatt of biological heating, running 24 hours a day, completely free. No fuel, no effort, no cost. And by the laws of physics, this warm air naturally rose, traveled through convection, and drifted toward the human living area at the higher end of the building. In the depths of a Hebridean winter, this biological heating system alone could maintain interior temperatures 5 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than the freezing world outside, even with no fire at all. Humans and animals were not just sharing space, they were sharing a survival system. Layer 2, the central fire, and the missing chimney. At the heart of the Blackhouse burned the kegel, a central peat fire, placed directly on the stone floor. And here is the detail that stops every modern engineer cold. There was no chimney, not because they forgot, not because they did not know how to build one, but because a chimney would have been a catastrophic mistake. Here is the physics. In a modern house with a chimney, the stack effect pulls warm air up and out through the flue. To replace that escaping air, cold air is sucked in through every crack, every gap, every opening. In a standard home, this process wastes up to 50% of all the heat you generate. Half your warmth gone, straight up the chimney. The Blackhouse had no chimney. So where did the smoke go? It rose naturally to the very top of the interior space, forming a thick, warm cushion of heated air just below the roof. That heat radiated back downward into the living space below. Then slowly, naturally, the smoke seeped through the porous thatch roof, taking with it only the minimum heat necessary to escape. The result? A heating efficiency that modern buildings still struggle to match. Layer 3. The smoke as a tool. Now living in a smoke-filled space sounds deeply uncomfortable. And yes, it required adaptation. But the smoke was not just a byproduct. It was one of the most powerful tools in the entire Blackhouse system. Peat smoke contains natural phenols and formaldehyde, powerful chemical disinfectants. As the smoke continuously filled the roof structure, it killed wood-boring insects and prevented rot in the thatch. Critical. In a climate where 80% humidity would otherwise destroy organic material within months, and the upper rafters of the Blackhouse functioned as a permanent industrial smokehouse. Meat, fish, and cheese were hung high in the rising smoke and preserved for the entire year. No refrigeration, no preservatives, no energy cost whatsoever. Just smoke and physics. And now, the most elegant part of the entire system. Once a year, typically in early summer, the old thatch was removed from the roof. By this point, it was saturated with soot, nitrogen compounds, and smoke residue. This material, what had been the roof just days before, was then spread across the island's poor acidic fields as a high-grade organic fertilizer. New thatch, made from the previous year's harvest, was then laid on fresh. And the cycle began again. The roof fed the fire fed the smoke preserved the food and protected the thatch. The thatch, when spent, fed the fields grew the grain became the new thatch. A perfect closed loop, zero waste, zero external input. These people did not just survive the Atlantic winter. They built a system so perfectly balanced, so intelligently designed, that the house itself kept everything alive. Now the Blackhouse was not just a home. It was a factory, a laboratory, a food storage unit, all inside 4 stone walls. And inside these walls, one of the world's most famous textiles was born. Harris Tweed. The process began with raw wool, carded and spun, right beside the central peat fire. But the most critical stage was called walking. The goal was simple. Take loose, soft wool and transform it into something tough, something so dense and thick that it could protect a human body against a Force 10 Atlantic storm. But to do this, they needed a chemical agent. And what they used will surprise you. Aged urine. The natural ammonia in urine stripped excess fat from the wool fibers, cleaned them deeply, and locked in the color of natural dyes. Groups of women would sit together, rhythmically beating the wet cloth against wooden tables to the beat of traditional songs, every inch, every fiber, perfectly compressed. Now the colors. Every single color in Harris Tweed came directly from the island itself. No synthetic chemicals, no imported dyes. Lichen scraped from sea rocks gave deep reddish-brown. Native heather gave dark forest green. Wild iris roots created shades of gray, and soot from the peat fire created the distinctive bog brown that made Hebridean tweed famous across the world. Every color told a story. Every thread came from this land. Now let's talk about food. In a landscape where soil is acidic, sun is weak, and fresh vegetables are almost impossible to grow, survival depended entirely on smart food preservation, The diet was simple: oats, fish, meat, all preserved by one thing: smoke. The most important protein source was the guga, a young seabird. Once a year, hunting teams sailed to a remote rocky island and harvested these birds. They were immediately salted in heavy brine, then brought back to the Blackhouse and hung in the rafters, directly over the smoldering peat fire. The smoking process was maintained between 20 and 28 degrees Celsius for approximately 20 continuous hours. This temperature range drove smoke particles deep into the meat, making bacterial growth completely impossible. The food stayed perfectly preserved for an entire year. No fridge, no electricity, no preservatives, just smoke, salt, and physics. The rafters of the Blackhouse were not just wooden beams. They were a silent 24-hour food storage system, running above the heads of everyone below. And before we close, there is one final part of the Blackhouse story that most people never talk about. Every single night, the woman of the house would approach the central fire. She arranged the glowing embers into a perfect circle, divided into 3 sections, then covered them carefully with ash. Enough to suppress the flames, but not enough to kill the heat. The fire smoldered through the night, barely alive, quietly breathing. And at dawn, she returned, uncovered the embers, and brought the fire back to life. This was called smolad, the smoring of the fire. And it was not just a ritual, it was smart engineering. A smoldering fire kept the house warm through the night, using far less fuel than relighting from nothing every morning. But beyond the engineering, the fire represented something deeper. A fire that died in the night meant the spirit of the home had left. By keeping it alive, through every storm, every winter, every generation, these people kept something precious burning. A connection to their ancestors, a promise to their children. So let's take one final look at everything we have seen. With no engineering degree, no modern tools, and no outside help, the people of the Outer Hebrides built a house that survived force 10 hurricanes, a house that heated itself using cattle and stone, a house that preserved food for a full year using smoke, a house that made world-class fabric from wool, urine, and island plants, a house that fertilized its own fields using its own spent roof. The Blackhouse was not primitive, it was not backwards, it was one of the most perfectly designed structures ever built by human hands. These people did not have more resources, they just understood what they had so completely that nothing was ever wasted. Not a stone, not a rope, not a single wisp of smoke. The Atlantic came for them every single winter. At this September morning, they uncovered their fire and carried on. That is the story of the Scottish Blackhouse. If this video changed the way you see the world, share it with someone today. And if you want more stories of forgotten human genius, hit subscribe, because there are thousands more waiting to be told.